is Chris Zeitler, and I'm assuming you're here because you want to learn how to surf. Well, what I'm going to do is kind of give you a basic rundown of what I think is important when you're learning how to surf, some basics before you actually even get close to getting in the water. The most important thing to remember is that you want to be safe. You want to be aware at all times. Just like any other activity, the more conscientious you are, if you're driving in a car and you're not paying attention to your periphery, looking around the car and checking what's happening around you, there's a chance that you're going to get hit or get in an accident. So when you're learning to surf, when you're practicing any activity, try to be very aware. So aware of what's happening around you, aware of the board, aware of the waves. So safety is first and foremost. Another safety tip is actually checking the conditions before you go out. So when you come down to the beach, you look straight out at what's going on. You look to see if there's any choppy or brown water. That's usually an indication that there's a rip tide. You look to see if the waves are too big for you. You don't want to go out when the waves are really big. Big waves usually means very powerful, and there's a potential to knock you down, maybe knock you out of breath, maybe even knock you out. So you want to make sure that you're not going out when it's too big. Some other important things to remember is also find out what's happening in the local area where you're at. If there's any possibility for jellyfish, any possibility for any kind of pollution. Nowadays, unfortunately, there's a lot of pollution out there, so you got to be cautious with that. But if you check with the lifeguard or even the local weather service, sometimes they'll have information. I call the city beach guards usually in the morning to find out what's happening. And then the next thing is you can also ask people around. So if you're new to a spot, ask somebody that you see coming out of the water if there's any special concerns that you should have about what's going on. Remember, the more information you have when you do any activity, especially surfing, the safer it's going to be. So that's safety. We're going to take a break for a moment. Come back. Okay, so one of the key components of learning how to surf is making sure that you're comfortable in the water. So I want you to actually look at the ocean when you get to the beach and see what the conditions look like. If the conditions look scary, if it looks too big, or perhaps you just feel like it might be not the right day for you because it's stormy. Stormy is usually when the waves are kind of all mixed up. The ideal scenario is when it's probably about shoulder to chest high and you feel like the waves are not going to be too, what's a good word for it, pounding. For the most part, we look for a higher tide because when the tide is high, the waves roll in more gently. So I highly recommend high tide for most places. I also recommend a beach break where the sand bottom is a lot more forgiving than reefs or rocks. If you do need to go to a place that's only got rocks or reefs, just be more conscientious about the bottom, because if you pearl, which is when your nose goes down into the water, your feet go up in the air, and you go diving for pearls, you actually have a much greater potential for getting hurt because there's obviously a hard bottom. Sand, unfortunately, is not the most pleasant thing to end up on your head in, but it's usually not as dangerous. So be conscientious if you have to surf on a reef or a rock bottom, that when you fall, and everybody does, that you try to protect yourself from the bottom. Usually when it's a soft sand surface, you only have to worry about protecting yourself from your board. And on that note, remember the safest way to protect yourself is one hand over the face, one hand over the head to protect your two most critical places of your body. So I've got well, maybe they've healed by now, but I used to have some scars on my arms from my fins and from my nose and my board actually hitting that area. But fortunately, I'd much rather have an injury on my arm than on my face or my head. So just be conscientious that the better you protect yourself when you fall off your board and you don't know where it's at, by protecting your arm over your face and your head, the more you're going to probably end up with minor injuries as opposed to severe. Let's see. So one of the things you want to remember is when you paddle out, you always want to keep your board going straight out or straight in. If you're going sideways, the wave's going to hit you and more than likely topple you into the coast. So try to make sure you go straight in, straight out, whether you're going out to get out to the surf break or whether you're coming in to ride a wave. You want to make sure you're going straight in or straight out. You You also want to paddle. So once you get set up for your wave, we'll turn you around, have you lay on your board and start to paddle. You want to get your momentum going when you go to catch a wave. If you don't have momentum going, the wave is going to hit you and just pass you by. Whereas if you're floating along at the same speed as the wave will just kind of gradually grab you and then pull you along so you get to ride it. In the beginning, you're going to do something called riding the whitewash. Riding the whitewash is basically waiting till the wave breaks and then riding the wave where it's nice and smooth. The first part of the wave is the most critical part and usually the hardest to learn how to surf on. And when it's breaking, as you get better, you'll learn how to take off when the wave is breaking and then go down the sideline of a wave on the face. But in the beginning, just to practice standing up and getting your balance, it's best to actually take off after the wave is broken. And what I call it is that there's this place where it breaks and then there's a big bounce. And if you've ever been out body surfing or swimming, you'll notice right after a wave breaks, there's a big explosion of water and whitewash. So what you want to do is wait until that bounce has happened and the water's exploded and moved, and then it calms down. And then your whitewash, which will be pushing you along, will be much softer. So what I do is I try to stay just inside of where the waves are breaking. So the wave will break and then go maybe 5 to 10 feet in front of that spot to wait for your wave and make sure that the wave is actually calmed down a little bit so that when you go to take off, you get a much smoother ride. It's going to be a lot easier to balance if you've got a smooth wave to take off the ride for your first couple waves. As you get better, your instructor will help you get more and more comfortable moving out farther and farther and maybe learning how to ride face waves. But in the beginning, just focus on learning how to manage your board, learning how to feel comfortable on the board. And remember, one of the things that you strive to do is get your position on your board correct. So when you look at this board, this is a short board. You're not going to probably be riding a short board right off the bat. With surfing, the shorter the more advanced it is. If you can imagine standing on something very small in the water, it's going to be a lot more difficult than if you have something big. My favorite teaching board is called Door, and it's a huge 10'6" board. And it basically is like trying to surf on a door because it's so stable and so big that almost everybody learns how to surf within a couple of waves on that board. For a small board, and I'm just going to demonstrate because it's easier to show you on this board, you're going to basically try to get your stance turned sideways along the stringer, which is the middle point of the board, and your feet about 2.5, maybe 3 feet apart. 2 if you're real small. But basically you want your feet spread apart and your knees bent so that you can balance. If you're standing up straight and your feet are together, you're gonna be a lot more unsteady. If you think about just standing on the ground, if your feet are together and you're standing up tall, it's a little less easy to balance than if you've got your legs firmly planted and your knees bent. Think about football players when they stand to guard for the offensive line, they're actually bending their knees, they're getting ready for to receive the impact. So to some degree we're doing the same thing. We're ready to receive the impact of the wave. We're also just getting a strong, steady stance. So bending the knees, typically when people first learn, they turn their feet to face forward. So both feet are facing forward on the board and they don't bend their knees. So they're kind of standing like this and it's very wobbly. As soon as you turn to the side and plant your feet bending the knees, you're gonna have a much more stable stance and probably a better experience on your first couple of waves. The other thing to remember is you don't want to stand too far back on the board or too far forward. We'll show you a little later where on the longboards to stand, but for the most part, you want to be a little bit towards the back, so maybe the back third of the board, but not so far back that the nose shoots up in the air like popping a wheelie. So you're going to have yourself on the back part of the board for the most part, with the feet separated. So on a short board, my back foot is going to be about on this traction pad, and my front foot is going to be up here a little ways, like I said, about 2 to 3 feet apart, and my knees bent. So between that position on the short board and the position on the long board, you're finding the ideal, I call it the sweet spot, on the board where you feel like you can get the most balance. The board's not tipping down, which is what we call purling. The board's not popping a wheelie, which is where you're pushing so much water, your board just ultimately ends up stopping because you have so much resistance. You want to be gliding on top of the surface of the water. So you want to be in the middle of the board, a little bit on the back end of it, because if you come up too far on the board, I guarantee you will end up purling, which is basically diving for pearls. When you're on the front end of the board, you'll all do this probably at least a couple times before you figure out how not to do it. You're going to set back so that if the board starts to go down, you don't lean into it. And that's another key factor. When you go to paddle, you can also paddle and purl. So when you're paddling, make sure there's about this much space between the nose of your board and the water's surface. So I call it the 3-inch rule. If your board doesn't have about 3 inches from the surface of the water, it's going to connect to the water and actually probably get grabbed by the surface of the water and pull you down into a purling motion. So try to stay with your board just enough that you can get maybe 3 to 4 or 5 inches of the nose of your board off the surface of the water, depending on how much scoop there is in the nose. And then that'll keep you from purling. There won't be that grab. So even when you're paddling, there should be that amount of surface area between, or the space between the surface area of the water and the top or bottom of your nose. Lastly, you want to make sure that when you paddle, once again, you go straight in. If you go to the side, you're going to be real wobbly. The wave's going to hit you and it's going to tip you over. So you want to go straight in for the beach, and when you paddle out, you want to go straight out. That way you can kind of cut through the waves as opposed to going straight in, getting toppled from side to side. Okay, so that's a little bit about paddling, a little bit about where you're going to stand. Next, we're going to have to talk about how to get up. Give us a second, we'll get you a better board. Okay, so this is what I consider a good learning board. It's soft. In the old days, we used to call it a Doyle. Nowadays, they'll call it a fun board or a soft board. The idea here is that it's nice and thick, it's soft, and this one is about 8 feet long. So like I've said before, you want a footboard that's between 8 feet and maybe 10 feet. The shortest being maybe 7 foot. If it's much shorter than that, you're going to have a really hard time balancing. So look for a board that's got some length to it. When we want to practice getting up, you can practice on the ground. I actually took the fins off this board so that I wouldn't crush the fins when I lay it on the sand. If you've got soft fins that are really not very sensitive, you can push them into the sand and lay on the board even with fins. But I prefer to be a little on the cautious side and not worry about my fins breaking out when I practice jumping up. So this board has no fins on it for now, so that I can lay it on the sand and practice getting up. Now when you go to get up, you're going to take your hands underneath your body around here near your chest, and you're going to push up like you're doing a push-up. So you're going to lay here, you're going to push up, and then bring your legs underneath you. So you're going to bring your legs underneath you and down nice and low, and then push yourself back. Okay, so this is what it's going to look like from the side. You're going to take yourself, hands back by the chest. You're going to do basically a push-up. So start to push up. Now, if you need to, push off the knees as well. So push the arms down into the board, lift up, and bring your feet underneath you. Now notice when I brought my feet up, I brought this foot forward, this foot back, and my feet are nice and wide. When I go to stand up, I'm going to try to stay low and keep my knees bent and my arms out. If you go straight up like this, you're going to fall. If you go all the way straight with your feet like this, you're for sure going to fall. So try to stay wide and low and look forward, because you're going to surf that direction, right? So don't look this way, look that way. Your hands can face that way, knees bent. You can actually even drop this knee in a little bit to kind of guide you that direction. That's all there is to it. Okay, to put on the leash. So you're going to take your leash, it's going to be Velcro, you're going to take it and put it on the back leg. So whichever leg is on the back of your board, you're going to put the leash around the ankle, wrap it tight, and make sure that the back portion of the leash is facing behind you, so that when you stand up, you don't have the leash getting caught underneath your foot. So turn the leash to face back, tighten it very securely to the leg, and you're off. So here we're going to look at a couple of different boards. The one on my left is a short board. It's a 6'2", maybe a 6'1", sorry, I can't remember. Short board with 3 fins, and the one on the right is actually a long board. Much better for learning. The longer the board is, the easier it's going to be for you to learn.
The soft board is also more conducive to learning because if you happen to get bonked by your board, you don't end up cracking things or breaking things. The advantage of the short board is basically as you get more accomplished on your board, you will have the ability to maneuver better. You will have the ease to dive underneath the waves as opposed to having to throw the board over the top of the wave or trying to turtle dive, which is something you may get to see later when we get in the water. But basically it's a little easier to maneuver, it's a little easier to turn and handle in the water. Whereas the board that's got some length is going to be much more stable. So when you go to take off on waves, you actually have the ability to balance better. So start with a long board and work your way down as you feel more and more comfortable.
This is a thruster. So this is a board that has 3 fins. So you can see the 3 fins here. It also typically is on a short board. Nowadays they're actually making 3-fin or tri-fin longboards, which make them a little more maneuverable. But for the most part, a tri-fin is on a short board, and it's designed to make the board a little bit more loose than if you only had a single fin. On the basics on this board, this is called the rail. It's the side of the board. This is called the deck. That's the part you stand on. That's also the part you put the wax on. This is actually called track top. And track top or a traction pad is designed to actually take the place of wax. So you wouldn't wax this. It's just so that when you put your back foot on the board, you've got a little more padding. This is called the tail, and the part up here that you can't really see is called the nose. And okay, so the deck, the rails, the tail, the nose, the leash, the track top if you like it. Some people don't like it. It can actually mess up your knees. And the bottom of the board and the fins. So that's the basics of the board.
So there you have it. That's your introduction to surfing. I hope that you enjoyed it. A quick review on how to get up. That's our most important part once you get to the beach. You might practice at home. Take your hands next to your body. Once you've paddled into the right position, place them on the board. Do a little push up. Bring your feet to the side. Keep your knees bent. Remember, if you stay low and don't straighten your legs, you'll balance better. If you keep your feet apart, you'll balance better. Look to the front where you're going and have a good time. See